Good morning and welcome to my blog, Wisdom for Today. And it's welcome to this very snowy morning here in Connecticut for those of you who live in this area. You know, whenever I get overwhelmed by the events in history, there are certain Bible verses I turn to. And one of them is from the book of Lamentations. And I bet some of you turn to the same verse. Now, if you don't remember it, Lamentations was written after Babylon came in and conquered Israel and took all the very wealthy and the very educated and young out of the city. The people who were left behind were the old and the failing and the dying. And some people think that the author of Lamentations is Jeremiah. If it wasn't Jeremiah, it was a prophet that talked a lot like him. But whoever this prophet was, he looks around at his city that's been destroyed. And he says, vanity, vanity. In other words, frivolity, foolishness, nonsense. All is foolishness and nonsense. Because he's angry at the poor decisions that were made that brought his civilization down to be conquered. But in the middle of this complaint, the prophet stops and says, but the Lord's loving kindness indeed never ceases. His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. Now the word loving kindness, if you have a more modern translation, is translated as mercy. And that is a good word. But I like the word loving kindness because it's more descriptive. In fact, when I go directly to the Hebrew, it's more loving goodness. Love wrapped in goodness. And then faithfulness is more of a stubborn caring. It is firmness, steadiness. So when the world falls about me, I know that God's love is stern and forever. Now, how did the prophet see that when everything he loved had been destroyed? Because the prophet still experienced God's mercy in himself. And I think the prophet saw the opportunity for healing and recovery if people would turn back to God and obey his principles and practice his justice. I think that was the hope that he saw, is that God had not abandoned them, but they needed to turn back to God. You know, another verse, I'm going to talk about great is thy faithfulness, the hymn, because I can't talk about this verse without talking about that. But before I do that, I want to talk about two other verses that remind me that God's goodness will triumph if we turn back to him. The other scripture that came to mind was Psalms 103, 12 through 10. 10 through 12. It says, he has not dealt with us according to our iniquities, nor rewarded us according to our sin. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his loving kindness, and that word is mercy as well, toward those who reverence him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. So God being high above us doesn't mean that he's not near us. It means he sees the whole perspective. Just as you get away from a situation, you can see the beginning and end. God sees the beginning and end. I think of Martin Luther King's statement that the arc of justice is high and long-reaching. What he meant for that is that it takes a long time for justice to be worked out sometimes, but it will happen, because God sees everything from the beginning to the end. And the last one that I want to share with you is from the book of James, chapter 2, verses 13. And it's the last verse inside the book, it's the last phrase inside this verse. It says, mercy triumphs over justice. So in other words, when I get upset, I think I'm going to do the best I can with what God has given me to proclaim God's truth, his kindness and his justice, and I'm going to leave the rest to God. So there's a part that I do and there's a part that he does. But I'm going to leave the rest to God, is understanding I'm not going to worry my gut out over it. If this prophet, in the midst of his city falling, could see God's goodness and hope, I will put my hope in him, so can I, if people turn to him. Now, Thomas Chisholm was the one who wrote Great is Thy Faithfulness. And before I tell the hymn story, I want you to know he vehemently disclaimed that his hymn had anything to do with his life. He says that he wrote it because he read the book of Lamentations, chapter 3. But yet his life explains it. Thomas Chisholm was a bright man. At age 14, he had educated himself at home and self-educated himself, and he was so smart that he was able to teach school at that age. He became a school teacher. And then at age 16, he became the editor of his town's newspaper, even more intelligent and smart. And he found faith in Jesus Christ, married the woman that he loved, had 3 daughters, and became a pastor. But in his late 30s, he became sick. He got a form of pneumonia and almost died a couple of times, and the hospital bills were so great that it drove the family into poverty. And because he couldn't work, his daughters, who had really been destined for good marriages and to live a life of leisure, now became servants in other people's houses, as did his wife. But in the midst of this, he still trusted God because he always saw hope in God being the solution. He said in his diary, "My income has not been large at any time due to my impaired health in earlier years which has followed me until now. I must not fail to record here the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God, that he has given me so many wonderful displays of providing care for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." And that's what caused him to say, "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. There is no turning or shadow with thee. Thou changest not, thy mercies they fail not. As thou hast been, thou ever shalt be." Now notice in that hymn, it's God's character we trust in. Not in ourselves, not in our efforts, not in our letters or our cries out for justice, but it's God's character that we trust in. That's why he says, he talks about the seasons in the next verse. Summer and winter, springtime and harvest. He's talking about we have different seasons in our lives. But God never changes, although the world around us changes. So we're experiencing some change. We have a big winter. And I have to say the snow is beautiful to look at and soft to touch. But it's cold and hard to shovel out of, and it's anxiety producing. But we know here on this earth that it's the season of winter. And springtime will come eventually. The snow will melt and the flowers will bloom. The same is true in our life. No matter what we go through, or our city goes through, or our country or the world goes through, we know that God will be faithful as we turn back to him. And like the prophet said so many years ago, we can say, "Great is thy faithfulness." I hope to see you in church this Sunday. And if not in church this Sunday and you live in a different place, please find a Bible-believing church to go to where you can worship God. God's blessings and have a good day.